The new podcast, In the Shadow of Princeton, starts as the matriarch of a prominent Princeton family is found stabbed to death in her locked basement. Investigators look from a serial attacker to her family to Princeton University students. One hot-blooded investigator sees a conspiracy. Is he way off base, or does privilege let you get away with murder? In the Shadow of Princeton is available wherever you get podcasts, or you can binge it ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Julia Silverman, and I'm the Oregonian's K-12 education reporter. But this fall, I've been periodically on temporary assignment to our politics team, as we have a very consequential election coming up in just 15 days. Maybe you've heard about it? Today I'm with John Horvick, the Senior Vice President at DHM Research in Portland, to talk about new polling results from John's firm that Oregonian reporters have been and will be analyzing over the coming days. Welcome to the show, John. Thanks for taking this time to speak with me.
Glad to be here.
Let's start with the results of the poll you did on the Portland mayor's race. You spoke to 600 likely voters with a margin of error of 4.4% and got some surprising results, at least for me. Tell our listeners a little about what you found.
Well, this survey, we asked about a lot of different things, so the mayor's race included, but this was a look broadly across the region about the issues that matter to them, how they're viewing their elected leaders in their community, how they see their job performance, and so covered an awful lot. And while we were there, of course, we wanted to ask about that important race for mayor in Portland. The results are, quite interesting, quite maybe surprising. I think maybe less surprising as we sit here in mid-October than they would have been in mid-September. Because what we found is that after you go through all the ranking, we'll sort of describe this, that Keith Wilson was actually ahead of Renee Gonzalez in the final round.
Who?
And what's surprising? Keith Wilson, exactly, right? So what's surprising about that is we think back to last year. We have 3 members of city council. So by definition, they've all won citywide and have demonstrated some community trust, or at least trust among the voters, at least in one election cycle. So there's perception that, there was really a race between those 3. And really, I think if you looked at the fundraising, you looked at sort of the activity, there was a perception it was really a race between 2 people, Renee Gonzalez and Carmen Rubio. And so surprise, surprise, Keith Wilson we see ahead. Lots of things we can talk about this, but Portland has ranked choice voting now. And so in order to win the final outcome, you need to be on people's list towards the top, but don't necessarily need to be the person who gets the most first round votes or the first choice votes. And we see in the first choice, Renee Gonzalez is leading, but then once you sort of go through the various rounds, Keith Wilson's ahead. And sort of why is that? Well, first, why is it not a 2-person race anymore? And, the big part of that reason, maybe not the only reason, a big part of that reason is about a month ago, the Oregonian, did some dogged reporting and, found a driving record from Carmen Rubio that many voters have found unacceptable or maybe even disqualifying. And so people maybe who were looking for we're thinking of voting for Carmen Rubio, I think comes from the progressive side of the slate here among our candidates, looking for somewhere else to go. And then Renee Gonzalez, for all his strengths, his clear articulation, we sees the problems in Portland are public safety in particular. He doesn't have majority support for his positions out of the gate. And so with Carmen Rubio's maybe falling down because of her personal situation, Renee Gonzalez having a core base of support but not a majority, it gave an opportunity for someone who was maybe not everybody's favorite but broadly acceptable as a number 2 or 3. And that's where we find Keith Wilson at this point. So the ranked choice voting potentially, at least as we poll, a month before the election, could result in a different outcome than we would if we had the former system of electing our mayors, which first past the post type of system.
It's incredibly fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the undecided voters in this election? Unlike
Well,
in,
important.
yeah,
Yeah.
because listen, in the presidential election, those people are like gold, like a needle in the
Hmm.
haystack. But for the mayor's race in Portland, there seem to be a lot of them. What level of uncertainty do you think that introduces into the race?
Well, quite a lot. So, the pollster sort of trick is to say our results are a snapshot in time. And, I understand why people might roll their eyes when they hear pollsters say that, but and sometimes it's more true than others. Like if you're talking about a presidential election, opinions about presidential candidates are pretty locked in. There's a lot of stability in those polls. Uh, but in this case, I would say it's really true. So we found out roughly a third of the folks out of the gate said that they didn't know who they're going to vote for as their first choice. And then you get to their second choices and third choices, that number of uncertainty even goes up higher. So our undecided voters, they tend to, compared to everybody else, they tend to be have less education, have lower incomes. We tend to see that in all sorts of polling where people who have that demographic profile are unsure about any number of issues we ask about, particularly on public policy and politics. Will those people find a home, a candidate to support? Will they, decide not to participate in the mayoral election at all? Maybe vote for president, but not vote in the mayor's race? Will they ultimately cast a ballot? Those are big unknowns. I think that these results help us understand the dynamics that are happening in this mayoral race as voters were getting their ballots. So this survey was completed just a couple days before ballots started going out. And I think this does a good job of describing what the dynamics are. And maybe reiterate myself, but I think it's important to say them again. Is that there is Portlanders are upset. Like, just about a third of Portlanders think the city's heading in the right direction. They're really concerned about homelessness and crime and public safety issues. And these have been persistent. And Renee Gonzalez does a good job of elevating those concerns. He also has done it in ways that has a strong base of support, but also some strong opposition out there. And I think that's picked up here. I think it's really picked up here. We didn't have polling, 2 months ago, but I suspect that Carmen Rubio would be much stronger positioned 2 months ago than she is now. And I think, although we didn't ask about it directly in the survey, I think it's no doubt that the reporting and the revelations about her driving behavior have really harmed her. And it's created this opportunity for a third candidate. And right now it appears is that Wilson is the beneficiary of that. Now, I will say, but Wilson has some advantages, right? He's not an incumbent. He doesn't have the baggage or the burden of the legacy of the last 4 years as an elected official. So he can point the fingers at those who have been in office without accepting the blame. That's one thing. The other is his plans around homelessness have been critiqued or criticized as being unrealistic. And I'm a pollster, not a policy guy, so people can make those judgments for themselves. But he's very clear that his top priority is what Portlanders say their top priority is in addressing homelessness and doing it with urgency. And so he's positioned himself in at least those couple ways is having an opportunity if one of our top two candidates stumbled, and it appears someone has.
So fascinating. So as you point out, we could find ourselves in a really different position in this race if not for ranked choice voting
Mm-hmm.
and Portland's new voting methods. For listeners who don't know, this fall, city candidates will be elected by a relatively untested form of ranked choice voting. Voters can choose up to 6 candidates in order of preference. City council candidates will only need 25% of first, second, and maybe even third and fourth choice votes in order to win. Based on your polling, do Portlanders feel ready for this? And how many people do you think will realistically bother to go beyond first or second choices? And I would add, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I still find it a little confusing.
So I want to sort of divide the readiness into two different sort of attempts at answering the question. The one is like Portlanders overwhelmingly supported these changes. Now, they supported these changes in 2022 at a time when they were especially negative about the direction of the city and the problems that we were facing. And at that time, the Charter Commission, just by law, it sort of meets on a schedule, and it was the time to meet, and this is what they decided to put forward. And so that there was fortuitous timing, but also The leaders of the Charter Review Commission put together a plan that was embraced by a large majority of Portlanders. So I do think like they're ready to move on from our existing form of government. I think also just, and this is more observational, just more sort of my engagement with the community rather than what we found in the poll. I think there's excitement about what's possible with this new form of government, about the opportunity to have district or local representation, about the chance to consider more than one candidate. Now, in our survey, we asked people how well they felt they understood the voting methods. And it's a bit of a, like, how you want to interpret the results, you might come to different conclusions. Because about 2/3 of folks said that they understood the system well. So that's a majority. That's a pretty big majority. If we're talking about like, somebody won an election by 2/3, you'd say, man, that's an overwhelming landslide. On the other hand, it's something as important as how we elect people, how we vote. That 1/3 of folks don't feel confident that they understand the system well. Well, that's not great. I wish as we were heading into things, more people feel confident. Now there are some demographic differences. It's a bit interesting to me. That is, one was by age. I might have expected younger people to say I understand things less well. They're newer to voting. They haven't voted as much. Young people tend to be less engaged in politics than those who are older. They said that they were more ready. Now that could be the confidence of youth. It's possible. Or it could be that older people are more accustomed to voting certain ways. They're more like small C conservative, more desiring the status quo, so to speak. But there is that age difference, and then there's education differences as well, kind of what we would expect with this. So, are people ready? I don't know. They have work to do between now and election day. And I'll just say, like, I have empathy for voters in Portland. I'm one of them. You think about all the things that are in front of them right now, all the way from the presidential election to, there's a handful of folks in Portland that will have that congressional election there in the 5th district with Janelle Bynum and Laura Chavez Dreamers. That's a competitive race for some folks to be paying attention to. There's interesting and important statewide ballot measures. There's a mayoral election. Depending on what district you're in Portland, you might have up to 30 candidates to be choosing from, and to rank them. This is an awful lot for people to take on, and they got some work to do between now and, well, ballots, like we're sitting here on the 17th of October. I mean, ballots are going to be arriving in people's mailboxes starting today.
I got a text from Multnomah County about that yesterday. I do love those texts. I have a neighbor who comes over every election season, and we sit in the backyard and we each have a beer, and we talk together about the choices in front of us. And because I work for the Oregonian, my neighbor is sometimes like, well, what, you must be informed. What do you think? And I was thinking about telling him this year, Mark, I don't know if I can do this with you, because I feel just like what you just said. I feel a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm not sure I can guide anybody else. I'm not saying he votes the way I tell him to vote. I'm just saying,
I hear you.
We talk about
it. My corner bar I like to hang out with, and it's a great neighborhood place. And of course, we talk about all things that you do at the bar, including what you do professionally, and folks know what I do. And so we're going to have a beer and ballots on Sunday. Well, I'll lead that. Of course, I'm not going to tell people how to vote, but I do expect people to come and have questions and try to help them feel more confident about what the work they have to do.
It's too bad this podcast is coming out on Monday, or I would make you tell everybody where that bar is going to be, and then you'd have all these people showing up. You're like, well, John will help me. All right, let's move on a little bit. Previous polling that your firm has done on the skeptical and negative perceptions of downtown Portland have really gotten a lot of attention. It's been 4 years now since the pandemic disruptions and the summer 2020 protests that really crystallized a new and different image of Portland in the national consciousness, certainly. Is there any sign from your polling results that people are now starting to change their minds about downtown?
Unfortunately, not much. Yeah. If I think about the overall survey results here, there are some things that I say, hey, not great historically, but improvements. So for example, when we asked people if the city, if Portland was heading in the right direction or not, 32% of Portlanders said the city's heading in the right direction. That's up from, in 2021, 8% of Portlanders in surveys are saying the city's heading in the right direction. And so if I look at like that comparison about just like big broad mood of the city, like 32% historically, if I look much further back, is not a good number, but it's pretty decent compared to a few years ago. And then there's some other places like, the kind of sense of whether or not homelessness is increasing, different parts of the city where maybe we don't have the level of concern we did when DHM and the Oregonian did the survey together back in April. But perceptions of downtown haven't improved. I mean, not markedly. So in April, when we worked together, 21% of Portlanders, or 21% of the people in the region, I should say the Portland region, so the 3-county region, said that they had a positive impression of downtown. It's 24% now. So if you want to squint, you can see a small difference there, although that change from 21% to 24% is not statistically significant, as we say in the polling world. And so that hasn't improved yet. And just as a local, as someone who goes downtown often, I think that there's been some signs of improvement, but broadly in the community, there's not. What I think is tricky when you're answering a question like this, if you're a poll taker, we can do our best to try to describe the parameters that we want people to think around. But when people are answering this question, are they really thinking about 6 months ago or a year ago, or are they really thinking about 2019? And I suspect a lot of people are thinking about 2019 or sometime, pre-COVID, pre-protests. And they're just telling us we're not back to that point yet. Even if we're making progress, we're not back to where we want to be, and they still hold quite a negative opinion of downtown.
Yeah. Thank you for framing it that way and that perspective. I suspect you're right. I want to ask as well about your findings on drugs, which I think is kind of connected probably to people's perceptions of downtown, real or imagined. I think that my fellow Oregonians can be forgiven for having some whiplash around state policy on drugs, given that we have gone from decriminalization to recriminalization in just a few years. Your polling found strong support for the state's decision to recriminalize possession of hard drugs. What does that tell you about the overall mood of the electorate, particularly in the Portland region, where voters have typically been among some of the most progressive in the country, less so in Washington and Clackamas County, of course, but certainly in inner Portland?
So my take is has multiple parts, but one is just keep in mind when Measure 110 passed. Measure 1 passed in November of 2020. That was a time where, by November, I can't recall if there's still protests happening in Portland, but about 100 days of racial justice protests that are occurring. It was a time when liberals, whether in Portland or across the country, were repelling against Republican administration and Donald Trump in particular. It's a time of people were questioning public health with COVID. So there are a lot of things that helped shape sort of attitudes about this issue at that moment. It was also, fentanyl and the kind of new class of meth, I think, existed in the world at that point, but it wasn't, at least to my memory, wasn't of the intensity or sort of availability as it was after 2020. The other thing is, if you go back and look at that ballot measure, I think a lot of people were prioritizing the reallocation of the cannabis dollars towards treatment. And then that was the primary thing that they felt that they were voting for. So Measure 110 did a couple things that decriminalized hard drugs, but also took the cannabis tax dollars and reallocated from education and maybe some other things, but education is a prime one, towards treatment. And I think, given the public health world that we're in, the sort of reevaluating the public safety world that we were in, there was just a sense that this was a better use of those dollars. I don't believe people were voting for open air drug use in the streets of Portland. I don't think that's what they were saying yes to. And when that's what they experienced, they said, no, thank you. I don't want that. And so they've moved. I'm not sure if they've moved to a new place. Like this is probably where they were in 2019.
Right.
And that we just discovered we didn't want what Measure 10 was delivering for us.
Certainly, yeah, there was this perception of like, oh, this is going to provide us with the addiction and treatment services that don't exist. In the same way, I might add that the city charter stuff really foregrounded, hey, we'll get a professional city manager. And, if you wanted that, you voted for that. And then you were like, oh, now we have 12 council members. Okay. So.
And also at a time in 2022 where it was a moment where, for a lot of reasons, like people were ready for change in Portland, which that doesn't necessarily mean they would have chosen this change on their own. But this was the change that was in front of them. And, we used a good process to do it. I'm not critiquing any of that, but we were mad about some things. We were frustrated about some things. We wanted some things to change. Measure 110 was the opportunity to do that. Comparing 110 to the charter is kind of unfair, but also it's like we're mad about, for the city, we're mad about some things. We're frustrated about some things, and they had an opportunity to say yes to something new, and they did. Now, I have higher hopes for our charter changes than the failures in 110, but there
see.
is some analogy there.
We'll see. Well, okay. I'd like to ask one final question, and I want to take it outside of Oregon for a minute, if you'll indulge me. Like a lot of people, I am slightly obsessed right now by the presidential election. Oregon does not get the kind of attention that Pennsylvania or Arizona or other swing states might get. But I'm sure I'm not the only Oregonian who is on pins and needles right now. And I'm looking at the polls nationally and in swing states, which feels sometimes like an exercise in frustration, since no matter what happens, they're just frozen in a tie. Can you help me and our listeners understand this? Are there any limits to polling in this day and age? And how much weight should we place on them in the context of the national election?
Well, there's different parts here. So it's absolutely limits to polling, which we could talk about the methodological challenges, the different techniques that people are using, that it's hard to know right now if there's something that's going to prove to be better or worse, because we don't know what the outcome is going to be yet. There's also the other part, what can polling tell us, particularly in these competitive races? I think that these polls are telling us it's close because it's close, and they're not changing because, in fact, opinion is pretty stable. The differences that we see are probably slightly differences in the sample based upon different assumptions about who's going to vote. The polls are useful they're very useful to campaigns to know who's undecided, for example, or who could be most motivated to vote. They're useful to, I think, the media to help articulate and explain to the community why people feel the way they do, what's motivating them, differences that exist across, the city or the state or the country. So they help us understand us better. But if you are a person who's living in Oregon and you're just very concerned about the outcome of the election come November 5th, and watching every poll that comes in, it's probably not a good use of your time or your sort of mental well-being.
I feel personally attacked right now, John.
Well, I do it too. So it's because of my role, I never give money to political candidates or causes. I create a clear line there. I don't want anybody to think that I'm doing my work to try to support one outcome or the other. But I think if you are somebody who is really engaged, really has a desire for one outcome or another, and if you want to use the polls, I would say use those polls to help you make a good decision about how to use your time and dollars.
In other words,
find competitive races to give your money to, find competitive races that you could go make some phone calls or knock on doors, but don't sweat what the outcome is going to be. Don't just sit in your living room looking at those numbers and getting anxious about it, like if you really, really care and you want to look at those numbers, use them to help you make some decisions, not to just build your anxiety up.
Okay, well, I hope my husband was listening to that, because that is exactly the advice that I've been giving to him for the last 3 months. So I was right and he was wrong. That's what I hear you saying. So, all right, John, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to talk to me today. The Oregonian has many more stories to come this week on the results of DHM's polling, including on approval ratings for Governor Tina Kotek and Multnomah County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson, and voter attitudes on homelessness. I'll drop links to the relevant stories in the show notes where you can read more about them. And with that, we're going to call it a wrap. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like the show, I bet you can predict what I'm going to say. Give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one, and frankly, our ability to do polls like this one with DHM, because good polling isn't cheap, and there's a reason for that, it's hard to do, is with a subscription to the Oregonian and Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.